Welcome. Tonight's story is one of those historical mysteries that refuses to stay buried. On a quiet Virginia plantation, enslaved babies were born with emerald, green eyes and golden hair, features that shocked everyone who saw them and raised dangerous questions no one dared to ask aloud. Before we go deeper, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on careful research and true historical records. Please subscribe, because uncovering facts like these takes time, effort, and respect for the truth. Colonial Virginia plantation society was built on a rigid hierarchy where land meant power, and power was guarded at any cost. Vast estates stretched for miles, owned by a small elite who controlled wealth, law, and social standing. At the top were plantation owners whose authority went largely unquestioned, while beneath them existed an enforced order that depended entirely on enslaved labor. This structure wasn't just economic. It shaped how people spoke, what truths could be told, and which stories were buried forever. Daily life on these plantations followed a brutal rhythm. Enslaved men, women, and children worked from before sunrise until darkness fell, cultivating tobacco and maintaining the estates that symbolized their owners' prestige. Overseers ensured obedience through punishment, while plantation houses stood as constant reminders of the imbalance of power. In this world, the personal lives of enslaved people were never truly their own. Even birth, family, and identity were controlled by those who claimed ownership over them. Race defined everything in colonial Virginia, at least on the surface. Laws were written to separate white and black populations clearly, reinforcing the idea that the ruling class was morally and biologically superior. These laws dictated who could marry, who could testify in court, and who was considered fully human under the system. Yet beneath this carefully constructed divide, reality was far messier than the rules suggested. Plantation society thrived on silence. Enslaved people learned quickly that survival often meant not asking questions and not drawing attention. Plantation owners, meanwhile, protected their reputations with equal intensity. Anything that threatened the image of control, purity, or authority was dealt with quietly, through intimidation, forced relocation, or falsified records. The truth was dangerous, especially when it contradicted the very ideology that kept the system alive. Religion and social customs were used to justify this order. Sermons preached obedience, while social gatherings among the elite reinforced shared beliefs about entitlement and dominance. These justifications allowed plantation owners to see themselves as respectable, even righteous, while participating in acts that contradicted their public morals. Hypocrisy wasn't a flaw in the system, it was one of its foundations. Within this society, enslaved women were particularly vulnerable. They existed at the intersection of labor, exploitation, and silence. Their bodies were considered property, and any violations committed against them were rarely acknowledged as crimes. Children born into slavery inherited not just bondage, but the consequences of a system that refused to recognize its own contradictions. It was within this closed, controlled world that anomalies became especially unsettling. When something appeared that did not fit the established racial and social order, it threatened the illusion holding plantation society together. And in a place where power depended on unquestioned narratives, Even a child's appearance could become a dangerous truth, one that society was desperate to explain away or erase. The appearance of unusual physical traits among enslaved infants immediately unsettled plantation communities. In a society obsessed with racial boundaries, the birth of babies with emerald, green eyes, and golden hair stood out as something impossible to ignore. These features contradicted everything the slaveholding system claimed about lineage and identity. Even a brief glance at such a child could raise silent questions that no one was supposed to ask. At first, these births were treated as isolated oddities. Midwives whispered, overseers looked away, and plantation owners dismissed the matter as coincidence. But as time passed, the pattern became harder to deny. More infants appeared with the same striking features, often born on the same estates or neighboring plantations. The repetition turned curiosity into unease, especially among those who understood what such traits implied. Among the enslaved community, these children were noticed immediately. Elders exchanged cautious glances, and mothers spoke in hushed tones, aware that observation itself could be dangerous. Many enslaved people understood far more than they were allowed to say. They recognized familiar features reflected in these infants, features seen daily in the plantation house rather than the slave quarters. For plantation owners, these traits posed a serious threat. The system relied on visible differences to maintain control, and children who blurred those lines endangered the illusion of separation. If others began to question how such infants were born, they might also question the morality and authority of those in power. That risk could not be tolerated. Some owners attempted to explain the children away using superstition or crude theories about inheritance. Others chose a quieter solution, moving the infants to distant plantations or selling them quickly to avoid attention. Records were altered, names erased, and dates adjusted. Paper became a tool to bury what eyes could clearly see. White society outside the plantations rarely discussed these anomalies openly. When rumors surfaced, they were dismissed as exaggerations or lies spread by those deemed unreliable. The credibility of enslaved people was systematically denied, making it easy to silence any uncomfortable truths they carried. Yet the children themselves remained living evidence. Their existence challenged the rigid racial rules that governed colonial Virginia and exposed the hypocrisy beneath them. No matter how carefully the truth was hidden, these unusual traits told a story written not in words, but in flesh, one that plantation society desperately tried to ignore. As more time passed, the repetition of these births became impossible to dismiss. It was no longer a single child or a strange coincidence whispered about once and forgotten. Infants with the same emerald eyes and golden hair continued to appear, often separated by only months, sometimes born to different enslaved women living on the same plantation. The similarities were so precise that even those who wanted to deny them found it difficult to look away. Patterns began to form in the quiet observations of those who lived closest to the truth. The children were not scattered randomly across Virginia. They appeared in clusters tied to specific estates. Their ages differed, their mothers differed, but their features remained hauntingly consistent. In a world where lineage defined fate, this kind of repetition suggested a shared origin that could not be explained by chance alone. Among the enslaved community, these patterns were carefully noted. Word traveled slowly and cautiously, passed in fragments during late-night conversations or brief moments away from watchful eyes. People compared dates, remembered movements of plantation owners, and connected details that official records never would. Though they lacked scientific language, they understood the implications with painful clarity. Plantation owners, too, noticed the repetition, even if they pretended otherwise. Each new birth deepened the risk of exposure. What had once been an uncomfortable secret now threatened to become undeniable proof. Repetition stripped away plausible excuses and replaced them with suspicion, forcing those in power to act more aggressively to protect their reputations. Some estates responded by separating mothers from their children early, ensuring fewer witnesses to the infant's appearance. Others transferred enslaved women shortly after childbirth, scattering the evidence before it could accumulate. These actions were framed as routine management decisions, but beneath them lay fear of patterns being recognized and discussed beyond plantation boundaries. The repetition also affected how these children were treated. They were watched more closely, valued differently, and sometimes punished more harshly, not for anything they had done, but for what they represented. Their very existence reminded the plantation of a truth it wanted erased, and resentment often followed that reminder. In the end, it was the repeated nature of these births that transformed rumor into quiet certainty. One child could be ignored, two might raise eyebrows, but many, all sharing the same unmistakable traits, formed a living pattern that no amount of denial could fully erase. And in a society built on control, patterns like these were the most dangerous evidence of all. Behind the repeating births lay relationships that were never meant to be acknowledged. Plantation owners held absolute power over the people they enslaved, and that power extended into every private space. What was publicly presented as order and morality often concealed coercion, exploitation, and abuse carried out in silence. These hidden relationships were not rare exceptions, they were an unspoken reality of plantation life. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse advances from those who owned them. Any resistance could be met with punishment, sale, or violence. What followed such encounters was treated as an inconvenience rather than a crime, especially when the man involved held status and influence. The imbalance of power ensured that responsibility never rested where it belonged. When children were born from these encounters, the burden of secrecy fell entirely on the enslaved mothers. They were expected to carry the physical and emotional consequences while remaining silent. Plantation owners, meanwhile, relied on their authority and social standing to shield themselves from suspicion, confident that no accusation would ever be taken seriously. Within plantation houses, servants and enslaved workers observed more than they were meant to see. Movements late at night, special privileges granted to certain women, and patterns of attention that went beyond labor did not go unnoticed. Yet observation did not mean safety. Speaking of such things openly was dangerous, and silence became a necessary form of survival. These hidden relationships exposed the deep hypocrisy at the heart of slaveholding society. Men who preached morality, family values, and racial superiority often violated all three in private. The same individuals who claimed to protect social order were actively undermining it, even as they punished others for far lesser transgressions. To protect their public image, plantation owners took deliberate steps to erase traces of these connections. Birth records were vague, fathers were unnamed, and children were categorized solely by the status of their mothers. This legal framing ensured that no matter how obvious the resemblance, the truth remained officially invisible. Yet no amount of control could fully erase reality. Faces carried resemblance, eyes reflected familiar colors, and hair mirrored textures seen in the master's household. These children became living reminders of relationships meant to remain hidden, silently exposing a truth that plantation society worked relentlessly to deny. Silence on the plantation was not natural, it was enforced. Everyone understood that certain truths carried consequences, and survival depended on knowing which subjects were forbidden. When questions arose about the origins of the emerald-eyed, golden-haired infants, those questions were quickly smothered, not with answers, but with fear. Silence became a rule as real as any law. Enslaved people learned early that speaking openly could cost them everything. A careless comment might lead to brutal punishment, separation from family, or sale to a distant plantation. Even curiosity was dangerous. Mothers were warned not to talk, elders cautioned the young, and whispers replaced words. Fear ensured that knowledge stayed fragmented, never forming a clear accusation. Plantation owners relied heavily on intimidation to maintain this silence. Overseers were instructed to shut down gossip immediately, and anyone suspected of spreading rumors was disciplined publicly. The goal was not just punishment, but example. One act of violence was meant to silence dozens of voices. Fear traveled faster than truth. Legal systems reinforced this enforced quiet. Enslaved people were barred from testifying against white citizens, making any accusation legally meaningless. Even if the truth was widely known within the quarters, it had no official weight. This imbalance ensured that silence was not just expected, but structurally guaranteed. Within white society, silence took a different form. Neighbors, clergy, and local officials often suspected more than they admitted, but confronting a powerful plantation owner threatened social standing and economic ties. It was easier and safer to look away. Complicity disguised itself as ignorance. Children born from these hidden circumstances grew up inside this wall of silence. They sensed that their appearance carried meaning, yet received no explanation. Questions went unanswered, glances lingered too long, and sudden transfers between plantations spoke louder than words ever could. Silence shaped their identities before they could understand why. In the end, silence was the glue that held the system together. It protected reputations, preserved power, and buried responsibility. But silence also left scars, on mothers forced to endure in quiet, on children denied truth, and on a history distorted by everything it refused to say out loud. Without modern science, people in colonial Virginia lacked the language of genetics, but they were far from blind. Repeated physical traits were recognized through observation, memory, and lived experience. Emerald eyes and golden hair were not abstract concepts. They were visible, undeniable markers that connected children to a familiar source. Even without DNA or biology textbooks, people understood inheritance in practical, if unspoken, ways. Enslaved communities relied on careful observation to make sense of the world around them. They noticed who resembled whom, which features repeated across generations, and how certain traits appeared only under specific circumstances. Knowledge was built through pattern recognition, passed quietly from elders to younger members. Science was absent, but understanding was not. Plantation owners also understood more than they admitted. They may not have known the mechanisms of genes, but they knew family resemblance when they saw it. Similar eye color, hair texture, and facial structure were impossible to ignore, especially when mirrored in their own households. This awareness fueled anxiety, because recognition brought responsibility, and responsibility threatened power. Lacking scientific explanations, some attempted to cloak reality in superstition or false theories. Claims of mixed blood, behaving unpredictably, or traits appearing mysteriously were used to confuse rather than clarify. These explanations were not meant to inform, but to deflect attention away from the obvious human cause behind the similarities. Midwives and healers held particularly dangerous knowledge. They witnessed births up close, saw patterns repeat, and understood the physical realities of reproduction better than most. Yet their insight made them vulnerable. Speaking too clearly about what they observed could place them in direct danger, forcing them to mask understanding behind ritual or silence. Records, when they existed, avoided detail. Fathers were rarely named, descriptions were minimal, and anything that might suggest lineage was omitted. The absence of scientific proof worked in favor of those in power. Without formal evidence, truth could be dismissed as rumor, no matter how often it appeared. Still, clues persisted. Faces told stories that paper refused to record. Without science, truth survived through memory, resemblance, and repetition. And while the system depended on ignorance, it was haunted by a quiet, shared understanding, one that required no microscope to recognize what was already written in plain sight. Rumors spread quietly among the enslaved community, carried not by words spoken aloud, but by glances, pauses, and shared understanding. On plantations where survival depended on caution, information moved in fragments, never fully stated, never written down. When infants with emerald eyes and golden hair were born, people noticed, and the knowledge traveled slowly from one cabin to another. These rumors often surfaced at night, after long days of labor, when watchful eyes were fewer. Around low fires or in whispered conversations, enslaved people compared memories and observations. They spoke of children who looked alike, despite having different mothers, of features that resembled those seen in the plantation house rather than the quarters. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood who was being implied. Older members of the community played a crucial role in shaping these narratives. Having lived through years of observation, they remembered past births, past disappearances, and past punishments. They warned the younger ones to listen more than they spoke. Rumors were not entertainment, they were survival tools, teaching lessons about power, danger, and silence. As these stories circulated, they became more than gossip. They formed a shared awareness of injustice that could not be openly challenged. Enslaved people learned who to avoid, which paths were unsafe, and why certain women were suddenly moved or sold. The rumors helped explain actions that official explanations never could. Fear shaped how far these whispers could go. If an overseer drew near or a stranger appeared, conversations stopped instantly. The danger of being overheard was real, and punishment was swift. Rumors survived precisely because they were incomplete, enough to understand, never enough to accuse. For children born into this atmosphere, rumors followed them like shadows. They sensed they were being watched differently, spoken about differently, even if no one explained why. The knowledge existed around them, but was never handed to them directly, creating a silence that felt personal and isolating. In the end, these quiet rumors became a parallel history, one that never appeared in records but lived on in memory. While official documents erased truth, the enslaved community preserved it through careful, whispered understanding, passing it forward in fragments strong enough to survive, yet quiet enough to endure. Plantation records were meant to project order, control, and legitimacy, but they were often carefully edited versions of reality. Births were logged, numbers were counted, and property was tracked. Yet the most important details were routinely omitted. Names of fathers were almost always absent when enslaved children were recorded, reducing human lives to inventory while shielding those responsible from scrutiny. These documents followed a deliberate pattern. Enslaved infants were listed under the status of their mothers, with vague dates and minimal description. Physical traits, when noted at all, were described in neutral or misleading terms. Anything that might suggest lineage, resemblance, or connection to a white household was quietly excluded. Paper became a tool not of truth, but of concealment. Clerks, overseers, and estate managers understood their role in this system. They recorded what plantation owners expected to see, not what they actually observed. Accuracy mattered only when it protected wealth and reputation. A missing name was not an oversight, it was a decision, one that ensured plausible deniability if questions ever arose. Church records, which might have offered clarity, were equally selective. Baptisms of enslaved children were sometimes recorded without parentage or skipped entirely. Religious institutions, closely tied to plantation elites, often mirrored the same silences found in estate ledgers. Faith did not challenge power, it adjusted to it. When children were sold or transferred, records grew even thinner. Ages changed, descriptions vanished, and identities blurred. This fragmentation made it nearly impossible to trace a child's origins later in life. Each transaction further erased evidence, turning real people into disconnected entries scattered across books and counties. For historians, these gaps speak louder than the words that remain. Patterns emerge not from what is written, but from what is missing. Repeated omissions, unnamed fathers, and vague descriptions clustered around certain plantations. Absence itself becomes evidence of intentional erasure. These missing names denied children their history and protected those who caused their suffering. Records that should have preserved truth instead buried it, creating an official story stripped of accountability. Yet even in their silence, these documents reveal the lengths to which plantation society went to hide what it did not want remembered. The existence of these children exposed a deep moral contradiction at the heart of slaveholding society. Plantation elites presented themselves as honorable, civilized, and morally superior, yet their private actions directly violated the values they claimed to uphold. Publicly, they spoke of order, Christian virtue, and racial purity. Privately, they exploited the very people they declared inferior. This hypocrisy was not accidental, it was structural. Slaveholding ideology depended on portraying enslaved people as less than human, which made exploitation easier to justify. Acknowledging shattered bloodlines would have shattered that illusion. If enslaved children could resemble their owners, then the moral distance that justified slavery began to collapse. Men who condemned immorality in sermons and social gatherings often lived double lives. They enforced strict codes of behavior on enslaved people while exempting themselves from those same standards. Any consequences of their actions were shifted downward, carried by women who had no power to refuse and children who had no voice at all. White society largely accepted this contradiction without challenge. Status and wealth insulated plantation owners from accountability, and confronting them threatened social harmony and economic stability. It was easier to condemn abstract sins than to face the reality unfolding within familiar households. Even laws reflected this hypocrisy. Children inherited the status of their mothers, not their fathers, a legal structure that allowed white men to profit from their own abuses. This ensured that no matter how obvious the resemblance, the system remained intact and ownership unquestioned. Law became a moral shield rather than a guide. For the enslaved, this double standard was impossible to ignore. They witnessed how rules bent for some and broke others. The injustice was not theoretical, it shaped daily life, reinforcing the understanding that morality under slavery was selective and self-serving. In the end, these children embodied the truth slave-holding elites tried to deny. Their presence revealed that the system was not built on moral authority, but on convenience, control, and denial. The hypocrisy was not a flaw, it was the foundation that allowed the system to survive as long as it did. Speaking the truth in plantation society carried consequences that extended far beyond words. For enslaved people, even hinting at uncomfortable realities could invite swift and brutal punishment. The system was designed so that truth itself became dangerous, especially when it threatened those in power. Silence was safer than honesty, and fear ensured that most people understood this without being told. Those who came closest to the truth, midwives, household servants, and trusted laborers, walked a constant line between knowledge and survival. They saw patterns others pretended not to see, yet they learned to guard their expressions and control their speech. A single misstep, a careless comment overheard by the wrong person, could lead to violence, sale, or permanent separation from loved ones. Even white individuals who recognized the truth faced risks. Overseers, neighbors, or distant relatives who questioned a plantation owner's behavior risked social exile or economic retaliation. Challenging a powerful man meant challenging an entire network of influence. As a result, many chose silence, convincing themselves that what they suspected was not their responsibility to confront. The danger of truth extended into daily interactions. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain people entered the room. Eyes lowered, voices softened, and topics changed. Fear shaped language itself, teaching people how to communicate without saying anything directly. Meaning lived between words rather than inside them. For children born into this atmosphere, truth was something sensed but never explained. They grew up feeling the weight of unspoken knowledge, noticing how adults reacted to them differently, how conversations shifted around their presence. Questions went unanswered, not because answers didn't exist, but because giving them was too risky. Attempts to challenge the silence were rare, but when they occurred, the consequences were severe. Stories circulated of people who spoke too openly and paid the price. These examples reinforced the lesson that truth was not a shield, it was a liability in a system built on control. In the end, the danger of speaking the truth ensured the survival of the lie. Fear protected power, and silence became an act of self-preservation. The truth remained present but buried, carried quietly by those who knew it, waiting for a time when it could be spoken without punishment. The trauma created by these hidden histories did not end with a single generation. It passed quietly from parents to children, shaping identities formed in silence and uncertainty. For enslaved families, lineage was fragmented by design, and the absence of truth became a wound carried forward rather than healed. What was never spoken still left its mark. Children born with features that set them apart often grew up feeling divided, even if they could not explain why. They were treated differently, watched more closely, and sometimes resented by both sides of the plantation divide. Without answers, many internalized confusion and isolation, sensing that their very existence disrupted an order they did not choose to challenge. Mothers carried a particularly heavy burden. They bore the memory of what had happened, the knowledge of who was responsible, and the pain of never being allowed to name it. Unable to protect their children from judgment or separation, many learned to harden themselves emotionally, passing on caution instead of comfort. Survival often meant withholding the truth, even from those they loved most. As generations passed, these unspoken realities shaped family dynamics. Stories were incomplete, ancestors unnamed, and origins obscured. Identity became something unstable, built from fragments and guesses rather than certainty. This loss of personal history was not accidental. It was one of slavery's most enduring harms. Even after slavery ended, the trauma did not simply disappear. Descendants carried inherited silence, mistrust of records, and gaps in family narratives. The absence of acknowledgement made healing difficult, leaving questions that could not be answered by documents or public memory. Communities attempted to preserve what they could through oral tradition, but even these stories were shaped by fear and caution. Names were avoided, details softened, and truths encoded rather than stated outright. Trauma influenced not only what was remembered, but how it was remembered. In this way, generational trauma became part of the legacy of these hidden histories. It lived on not just in bloodlines, but in silence, in fragmented identity, and in the enduring struggle to reclaim stories that were deliberately erased. History has a way of discarding what makes it uncomfortable. Official narratives favored power, dates, and ownership, leaving little room for stories that exposed exploitation and hypocrisy. The mystery of these children was not lost by accident. It was pushed aside deliberately, buried beneath records that told only what was safe to remember. As years passed, plantations changed hands, documents decayed, and first-hand witnesses disappeared. Without written acknowledgement, These stories faded from public memory, surviving only in fragments passed through generations. What remained was an incomplete version of history, one that spoke loudly about wealth and progress while remaining silent about the human cost behind them. Later historians faced the challenge of piecing together truth from absence. Missing names, vague entries, and repeated patterns hinted at something deeper, but certainty was difficult to claim. When evidence is intentionally erased, recovery becomes an act of interpretation rather than discovery. The mystery endured not because it lacked clues, but because those clues were scattered and suppressed. Communities connected to this history often carried knowledge that never reached textbooks. Oral traditions, family memories, and quiet acknowledgments preserved truths that formal history ignored. Yet without validation, these accounts were often dismissed as rumor rather than recognized as lived experience. The erasure also shaped how society understood slavery itself. By ignoring stories like these, history softened the reality of exploitation and reduced complex human suffering to abstract facts. What was lost was not just information, but empathy and accountability. In recent years, renewed efforts to examine overlooked records and listen to marginalized voices have begun to challenge these omissions. The mystery remains partly unresolved, but acknowledging its existence is itself a step toward restoring what was erased. Recognition does not change the past, but it reshapes how it is understood. Ultimately, this mystery endures because history chose silence over truth. Yet the very persistence of unanswered questions serves as evidence that something vital was hidden. What was erased still echoes, reminding us that history is not only what is written, but also what was deliberately left out.